If you've ever thought, well, what I could do really won't matter that much, well, I'm glad you're here then for this conversation today. Hi, I'm Rob, and it's great to be able to catch up with you for a few moments here today. Let me mention our interactive teaching videos that are available for kids and families. A simple search for Cabin Kids on Facebook will take you right to our page and that resource. And as you may know, our focus in these videos also spring from the same themes and scriptures in the family videos that we just mentioned. So our goal is to equip families of all ages to have faith conversations that can be helpful as we seek to follow Jesus together. Now, we all love stories. Stories where people collaborate, where they do more than they could have ever done alone. And, it sometimes is interesting to wonder what keeps us from working well with others. Most times, we can kind of point to everybody else and think that they're the problem. But we do all have a lot to discover about working with some difficult people and also to be someone who collaborates well. Now, you may already know this, but collaboration is actually a spiritual concept that originates with God. God created us to work and operate in community. Throughout the Bible, we see how God brought people together to be part of important moments through collaboration. And working together actually allows us to demonstrate the love of God because of the way that we love one another, and it points people to Him. So let's jump into what we can discover together today. In one of the places that we lived, we had the privilege of visiting one of the tracks that's used for NASCAR races. And we were there on a non-race day. And the group of people that I was with, out of that crew, one person was chosen at random to ride in the jump seat of a race car on the track. It wasn't me, but we had a fun time watching them ride. And there were people that were there that were so much more involved in racing than I am. I find it very fascinating and interesting to think about the strategy and the pit crew and some of the advanced work that's needed in order for the vehicle to run well, from the mechanics and all of the different engineers. So many people that make a race day work. So I got thinking, what if the person who changes the back left tire in the pit crew said, well, it's not really important because it's just one tire out of the whole vehicle? Well, we would know that the long-term success of the team would be sacrificed, as well as safety for that driver as well as so many other drivers. But because that person doesn't get profiled as much, sometimes it's easy to see that it's all about the driver. And there are so many more people that are lifting that driver up in order to make things happen. What we need in all of those settings are teams of people that care and that'll pay attention and work together. Because sometimes when things seem like they don't mean so much is actually a time when they might mean more than we know. Now, there are times that all of us have wrestled with that question. Why would my part in this even matter? It's an argument that we've had in our minds at one time or another, whether we've kind of felt like whether we couldn't really get started with something or that we should stop something. Maybe we have felt like our part didn't matter that much. It can happen at work or church or at home, wherever we encounter people. Now, the other day we looked at how the people of Israel were working together to build the tabernacle and how it allowed the life and work of God to be expressed and to demonstrate that His presence was clearly with them. Today, as we're thinking about working together and collaborating, we're actually looking into an account in the life of the Israelites where we can see that it would have been very different if just a couple of people had looked around and maybe withdrawn and said, my part doesn't matter, instead of realizing in the long term it really mattered a lot. So the account begins with a simple statement in Exodus chapter 17. In verse 8 it begins, while the people of Israel were still at Rephidim, the warriors of Amalek attacked them. Now, at this point, Israel had been in the desert for a little bit. As they traveled, this group called the Amalekites were taking advantage of their vulnerable position. There's a further insight that we can glean into this in the book of Deuteronomy. Moses is looking back on this moment, and you can check that out in Deuteronomy chapter 25. You'll find what he says about it in verses 17 and 18. Just for reference sake, though, the Amalekites were a brutal and opportunistic group that were really to become a consistent thorn in the side of the people of Israel. They were a nomadic tribe, and they were descendants of Esau's grandson, Amalek. Now, you got that right. Esau, Jacob's brother, had a grandson who had a tribe that was this much of a pesky nuisance to the cousins that were a part of his family. That Jacob and Esau, that conflict continues on in these distant cousins, and how this continues to materialize in the life and the people of Israel over time is actually kind of challenging to watch. They had a history, the Amalekites did, of attacking people for sport. They enjoyed killing and stealing whatever spoils they could get their hands on. Now, in the life of the people of Israel, here at this moment, this happens a pretty short time after they've left Egypt. They have crossed the Red Sea, and they were kind of just getting organized, and they'd just been exposed to their new food called manna. And in this case, the Amalekites had raided even some of the more vulnerable members of the tribes. They were people who were maybe traveling at the back of the traveling line, and women or children or some of the old or infirm, and the people who were helping them. At this point, the people of Israel had no military experience. They were a young and vulnerable group, and they're getting attacked by a seasoned group of desert raiders, brutal in their approach to the way that they handled life. So Moses calls for action, and this is where we get to meet Joshua for the very first time as we continue on in chapter 17. Moses commanded Joshua, it says in verse 9, "Choose some men to go out and fight the army of Amalek for us. Tomorrow I will stand at the top of the hill holding the staff of God in my hand." Now, this is the staff that you may be familiar with. The same one God told Moses to take with him when he went to Egypt. It became a snake in Egypt. He extended it over the Red Sea. And we know it wasn't a magic wand per se. But as we mentioned, this is early on in Exodus. And so pre-Mount Sinai, pre-10 Commandments, although they had experienced the power of God in Egypt, celebrated Passover, watched what happened with the Red Sea and experienced that, they were really still discovering who God really is. And so the staff for the people of Israel represented God's favor. And they really needed to rely on God's favor and His power to be able to accomplish things that were way larger than them, like defeating the Amalekites. Verse 10 continues, "So Joshua did what Moses had commanded and fought the army of Amalek. Meanwhile, Moses, Aaron, and Hur climbed to the top of a nearby hill. As long as Moses held up the staff in his hand, the Israelites had the advantage. But whenever he dropped his hand, the Amalekites gained the advantage." So, here we see Moses in a position that really is reflective of complete surrender and dependence on God. His arms extended with the staff that God had entrusted to him. Now, the people of Israel can see him, and his arms are up, and they can clearly understand that this is a victory that originates with God. But as his arms go down, they can start to see themselves as being their own source of power. His upheld hands stood not only as an appeal to God for help, but a statement as to where the power of their victory had really come from. So, without this posture of surrender, the Israelites really can't win against the Amalekites. But just wait a second here. Let's think about what's going on around us. Moses, at this point, is over 80 years old. Now, Aaron, his older brother by 3 years, is obviously even older. We're not sure how old Hur is, but some scholars suggest that he may actually be the son of Moses' older sister, Miriam. So he'd be Moses' nephew, and good chance he's probably in his mid-60s. So for Moses to hold up his arms like that, it was a physically daunting task, and he really didn't have the youngest members of the tribe with him at that moment. There are places where I've done work over my head in houses that I've lived in, whether it's painting or drywall work or whatever the case may be. Even as we renovated our children's ministry space here in our facility, we had a lot of work to do over top of our head with the ceiling material in that space, drilling holes to put in lights, dealing with all of the screws that were part of the metal ceiling. And we had to hold our hands up for quite a while, and every now and then you just had to hang them down because they would get tired after a while. You can probably identify if you've done any work over your head for any extended period of time. So for Moses to hold this staff up while the Israelites are fighting, it was a small amount of weight, but it could slide down so easily. And so predictably, verse 12 continues, Moses' arms soon became so tired that he could no longer hold them up. So Aaron and Hur found a stone for him to sit on. They stood on each side of Moses, holding his hands. So his hands held steady until sunset. As a result, Joshua overwhelmed the army of Amalek in battle. Genius! They held up his hands. This is exactly what Moses needed in order to succeed. Maybe you've heard this account before, and it's really rather a curious event in the life of Israel where physical posture reflects spiritual surrender, and helpers end up making the day. The story would have looked completely different if Aaron and Hur had stood by or walked away thinking, well, what could I do? There really isn't anything that I could do that would matter. Because it's in the time that it seems like things don't matter that they matter so much. There's a fascinating story from the life of children's TV legend Fred Rogers, known to most of us more affectionately as Mr. Rogers. In his own childhood, he would see stories in the news that were kind of scary, and he wasn't sure just exactly how to process them. And in a great insightful wisdom, his mother shared with him that he should look around for the helpers. It was a great way to assist a child in dealing with challenging events. Now, in his own life, Fred Rogers was someone who was very active as a helper, and so perhaps he would have changed that in his adult years to look around to be a helper. Someone who responds in the place that they are. Now, when we think about the scripture that we're looking at today, that's kind of what Aaron and Hur really did, didn't they? Moses needed help to hold his arms up. Aaron, his 83-ish-year-old older brother, and Hur, his mid-60s nephew, well, they saw what needed to be done, and they did it. They stepped into the gap and helped Moses with a little support. They looked around, and they became his helpers. Now, over the last week or so, I trust some of you have taken some time to investigate that extra reading that I mentioned in our last time together. Ephesians Chapter 4, verses 1 through 16 is something I encouraged many of you to take some time to read through several times this week and to dig around in some resources to research a little bit more about what it has to say about unity in the Spirit. Because Paul is helping us to understand where it comes from and how it continues to grow as a result of God's work in our lives as individuals and as a group. Now, if we think about this in terms of Aaron and Hur, God had placed them with Moses at that time. And Paul gives us in this passage a recipe for the places that God has put us to help someone succeed, to put ourselves, as it were, in the position to be a helper. Verse 2 kind of outlines it for us, that it comes from humility, gentleness, patience, and love. Now, many of us have some assumptions about what these words might actually mean, but let me expand on what Paul is referring to here briefly. When he talks about humility, he's talking about being confident in who we are, that we are confident that nothing is beneath us. And our example of humility is really Jesus kneeling down and washing the disciples' feet, willing to do what needs to be done, that it is not beneath us. He also refers to gentleness, which really sometimes could be interpreted in a way as weakness, but ultimately what he's referring to here is strength that is under control, that really our power doesn't need to be exercised in order to prove something, that we can be willing to give our power to help others. Patience is really about hopeful endurance, that there is no expectations that are a part of the conversation, being willing to invest even without getting credit or being recognized in the middle of it. And love is really about being responsive to a need. It's the kind of love that caused God to respond to us and our need of Him without hesitation, willing to step up without being asked. So the key is, as God grows these in us, it builds unity in the Spirit. It builds responsiveness. It builds an attentiveness in our lives to be able to meet needs, to be equipped to be a helper. Now, God grows this in our lives much the same way that a tree sprouts leaves. Because you don't necessarily watch a tree and think about it saying, I've got to squeeze out another branch, or I've got to grow so that I can get some leaves this year, pushing it out. But oftentimes when we think about some of these things, humility and gentleness, patience and love, that's kind of the way we approach growing it in our lives, isn't it? I've got to grow more patience. I've got to have God work in me so that I can be more loving. But actually, the job of the tree is to allow the roots to continue to be nourished and leaves continue to emerge. Now, there's pruning, there's cultivating, there's watering, there's good soil, there's so many different conditions that are a part of allowing those roots to develop, but ultimately the health of the roots are what help create the beauty of the tree to emerge. Not really pushing or squeezing in order to grow. So, as we think about that whole picture just for a moment, sometimes we might end up in a position where we need to be the one to change the back left tire in the pit crew. And it may be the driver that gets all the attention, but the pit crew are in the position to be the helpers. And sometimes God has placed us in positions to help others succeed as a helper in the way that He did with Aaron and Hur. And in Moses' case, what he needed was a little support. And if Aaron and Hur had come to the conclusion that what they were going to do didn't really matter, they would have been so wrong, because it's in that moment where it feels like things don't matter that ultimately we discover that they matter significantly. So where has God placed you? And what would it look like if you became more attentive to what it meant to be a helper? Aaron and Hur were just positioned by God to be in that place at that time. And they did what needed to be done. They didn't wait to be asked. If they hadn't, though, it would have mattered a lot. Aaron and Hur really help us to see that there are times when it may not seem like we have much to give, but it actually matters significantly in that moment as we work together to help someone else succeed. being willing to help someone else succeed, responding in the place where we are, growing and allowing God to use us to care, builds unity, and it builds humility, gentleness, patience, and the love of God continuing to grow in us, being demonstrated in a moment where we respond thinking, this doesn't matter that much, but ultimately following through and realizing that it matters more than sometimes we can realize. Just before we pray, let me mention the podcast extras. You'll find them as a link in the description box of either YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're watching this video. And in that link that will take you to our Kingston Standard Church website, there are a variety of resources for worship at home, as well as journaling and conversational application, and some links that are a part of our congregation as well that I would encourage you to check out. Let's take a minute and pray together. God, we're grateful to you for your kindness to us and the fact that you place us in situations that sometimes, well, it may not be that glamorous, but you've called us to be a helper. And like Aaron and Hur, we just find ourselves in a spot and somebody needs help, and I pray that you would help us to follow through, to have the courage to move beyond the moment where we think, well, what I would do won't matter that much, to where we realize that engaging and helping matters more than we sometimes realize. God, we thank you for the opportunities you put before us to display the beauty of your gentleness and your patience and your humility and your love growing in us. So God, today, thank you for the way that you nurture this as we continue to find ourselves driving deep in our roots with you. Help us as we grow to continue to exemplify the life of faith that you long for us to show. We love you. We thank you. In your name I pray. Amen. Thanks for allowing us to have a few moments to visit like this together today. And before you go, if you don't mind taking just a moment to like, comment, or share this video, it's always an encouragement for us when you do. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, or if you're watching us on Facebook, if you'd like to like or follow our page, that is a great opportunity for you to be able to stay connected to a variety of other posts along the way that will connect you to our congregation. Thanks so much for being here with us today. As always, we're praying for you, and we trust you're praying for us too. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.